whenever you talk about trade between Canada and the United States, one of the first industries to come up is forestry, lumber. And in BC, forestry is completely central to that province's economy. We're talking about a $10 billion industry. More than half of BC's lumber is exported to the U.S. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe was just in Prince George. That is the heart of lumber in BC. Lindsay, talk to us about the conversations you've been having with people there. Can they zero in on something they're most worried about?
They're worried about the survival of specific companies, whether they be big, medium, or small, and the survival of whole communities, because so many of these places in British Columbia rely on cutting down trees and selling them to the United States. We have to consider the context that any tariff anxiety is coming as we wait to see what happens today. Already, because of the ongoing softwood lumber dispute, there are duties in place for Canadian exports to the United States. That's sitting at 14.5%. The Trump administration has those set to go up to 20% in August. Then there's the worry about what could happen today. And on top of that, there is an investigation that the administration put in earlier this month or in early March, saying that they wanted to investigate the lumber industry. So that just piles anxiety upon anxiety upon anxiety that is not going to go away regardless of what we hear on the specifics of today. And it all couldn't happen at a worse time for forestry. Already, Adrian, we have seen lumber mills pick up and move south. A part of that is because it is simply cheaper to harvest trees in the southern United States. Canfor, the forestry giant, in the last decade has closed 10 of its 13 mills. And they moved to the United States where trees grow on plantations. They grow fast because it's warm. There are fewer regulations when it comes to how they're logged. And it's cheaper because labor is cheaper and there's not as much transportation, so you're not hauling or trucking all of those logs to mills. So add the tariff uncertainty onto that, and there is real worry. I spent a lot of time with a man named John Brink. He runs Brink Forest Products. What they do is value added. They take the odds and ends of other mills and put them together to create lumber. Goes to the United States. We were standing in front of rail cars that were set to go to Texas, and he was really worried about the industry. He got emotional. Here's what he had to say.
A lot of people will get hurt, losing their jobs, losing their businesses. I'm not afraid of myself, but yeah, a lot of people will lose their companies, especially the small and medium size.
Yeah, that's really hard to see that level of emotion. And Lindsay, I feel like when we're talking about lumber, that we've been talking about softwood lumber in particular for generations. I mean, I remember when I lived in Washington, I went to Georgia. I interviewed a man in a Georgia mill who was devastated by what the Canadians were doing. And there was a train that would go right through his yard, his lumber yard, carrying Canadian softwood lumber, which they said, look, everybody likes the softwood lumber because it's better to work with, it's lighter, it's easier to pound nails into. The tensions in this industry have been real for a really, really long time. That they're moving to the States, that's going to be hard for people to wrap their heads around. What's your sense of what you're hearing in terms of what can be done about this at this point?
People are starting to think about reframing the entire industry. Brink has said that, those deserted mills that are in Vanderhoof and other communities, he wants to buy them up and repurpose them to do more than just get the wood ready to ship off somewhere else, where you could actually do some kind of value-added manufacturing here in Canada. It's something that has been talked about, but when the business case changes, then that may be something that actually stays profitable. There's the idea that we've heard in so many industries about looking for new markets. Already some ships out of Prince Rupert have been loaded up with lumber taken to Japan. Expanding to Asia instead of relying so much on the United States, there might be a business case for that. We also can't forget that there are some environmentalists who say, hey, you know what? Now that this crisis is upon us, maybe this is a time to rethink the forest, to actually leave it for a while and find new ways for people who are employed by the forest to be able to find different work in different industries and take a more environmental approach. But I was really struck by how existential this felt for these communities that have been through so much, that have endured so much, and there's a real fear that this could be the final straw.
To look at how U.S. tariffs affect the Canadian economy, I'm joined now by Liz Kovach. She is the president of Supply Build Canada, formerly known as the Western Retail Lumber Association, and we've reached her in Winnipeg. Liz, appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
So Canadian softwood producers are already paying a tax just over 14% for their products. The U.S. Lumber Coalition said that these duties were necessary to ensure fair competition. Can you explain how additional tariffs that are expected today would have an impact on Canadian lumber?
Yeah, so what a lot of people don't realize is we haven't had a softwood lumber agreement with the U.S. for a very long time, and the U.S. Lumber Coalition has been one of the largest hurdles to that. They don't always necessarily put out factual information, and they've been accusing Canada of dumping cheap material south of the border. We supply 30% of what we produce actually goes south of the border because the U.S. cannot produce enough of its own material to meet their needs. That that duty of 14.5% is going to be doubling in August, which is going to have a really negative effect on Canadian producers. We're already starting to see a little bit of an impact in terms of demand. It's impacting some relationships south of the border. And anytime there's a slowdown in demand of product, it means that we're not necessarily producing as much. And if you add a 25% tariff on top of that, that is a 55% tax that is going to get passed on to the end users.
We've heard Donald Trump say it about many products, but I've heard him say, we don't need their trees. We don't need Canadian trees. What's your response to that?
Well, we know it's not true. There's a lot of research out there that indicates that obviously a good portion of the material that's shipped across the border comes from BC. There's a ton of research that has been done. And really, we have, as a forestry industry, operated as a North American market. You know, between our two countries, we can supply about 1.7 million starts in terms of building homes. So we know that our product is needed. And we also know that a lot of contractors really like to work with the Canadian product because it takes longer for our species to grow and it's an easier product to work with.
Tell me a little bit about that, because we were talking about this in our meeting and one of the producers brought that up in terms of Canadian softwood lumber is, for many home builders in the United States, preferred. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the climate is so different when you look at the, Pacific Northwest U.S. versus the southern states where they grow southern yellow pine. Spruce, pine, and fir tends to be the species that is natural to the more northern areas. And that's a preferred material because it's easier on tools. It doesn't warp as much. It's definitely a preferred product and it lasts a lot longer. So from a durability perspective, if there has to be a choice, that would be the one. Obviously, when it comes to building codes, you're able to use both. Southern yellow pine can substitute that. But we've heard many times that the producers or, the preferred material from the contractors that are using SPF, which is a spruce, pine, fir, is what they prefer to work with.
Your group posted a list, I understand, of local and independently owned building supply retailers because of the tariff threats. How important will it be for Canadians to look at domestic lumber retailers during this trade war?
It's massively important to support our local businesses. And there was an article that I think the Globe and Mail had ran a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about the impact of even just $25 a week being spent with a local Canadian business. It's massive because that means the economic impact the GDP is being impacted here because the money stays here. We also know that a lot of consumers out there feel maybe a little bit helpless in the situation. There's not a lot that we can control. But what we can control is where we spend our dollars. That equals a vote, if you ask me. And we wanted to make sure that we can support our members, which are really critical parts to the community. when you look at where a lot of those local lumber stores are, I call them the nucleus of the community, because they are all across the country, small towns, larger city centers, but they're the ones that give the charitable donations. They're the ones that are building the schools, the hospitals. They're such an important part of that infrastructure, and they're family owned. They provide employment opportunities for younger folks, for older folks. They really are an important, critical part to our economy, and we want to make sure we're doing our part to support them and then make sure that Canadian consumers know that they exist and can also support them versus some of the big box that's U.S. owned.
What do you think the federal government, other governments should do in retaliation for what may be coming this afternoon?
This is a tough question because we've never really been in this situation, so we're not really sure what the long-term impacts are going to be. But one thing that we know is as soon as you place a tariff or a counter tariff, it is going to inflate costs on our side of the border. We're trying to work towards housing affordability, and this isn't really going to support that. We definitely have to do something, and I think one of the things we really need to start considering is are we looking at a Canada First lens? How can we better support the industry? When it comes to the lumber side of things, the log costs and the production costs are the highest in BC. Is there a way the Canadian government can work with the forestry industry in BC to come up with different solutions so we can make it a little bit more economical and help to really support that industry? And ideally, if we can get to a softwood lumber agreement, the sooner we can get to that, the better we will be. But the tariffs are going to be an issue, as are the counter tariffs, because it's just going to inflate costs for the Canadian consumer.
Liz, thank you. Liz Kovach is the president of Supply Build Canada, formerly known as the Western Retail Lumber Association. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.